Today I wanted to run some tests to find out just how much your watercolor paper choice can end up affecting your final artwork, and if higher paper cost actually equals better paper quality. Now, all of this started because last year when working on a painting series, I spent 3 months using nothing but this wildly expensive Arches watercolor paper, like pretty much the most expensive watercolor paper you can buy. But then a few weeks later, I was filming some video and I grabbed a paper that I've used numerous times for videos, and it was like, what is happening here? It honestly felt like I'd forgotten how to watercolor paint for a minute because nothing seemed to be going well, stuff was drying weird, it just was not a fun painting experience. So ever since that point, I've been really interested in running a controlled test to be able to see and compare a range of different papers using the same materials so that we can ultimately see just how much the paper can affect the outcome of your art. I decided to pick 4 different papers for my collection that I feel fit a large range in terms of a watercolor paper price and just professional to student grade. I also feel like these 4 are in really even increments from each other. It's not like between 1 and 2 you're looking at like student grade to like 1,000,000% professional. I feel like this is just a nice even range. So I guess let's meet the contenders for this video. First up, we have the Canson XL watercolor paper. Now I chose this because this seems to be a very common paper that I see a lot of people using. It tends to be really easy to get, at least in North America, and I'm pretty sure, at least for me, this might have been almost the first actual watercolor paper that I ended up buying and using. So I feel like this is a good like entry level student grade, you know, someone's just getting into watercolors. This is possibly the paper someone would be picking up, and I wanted to see how something like this would compare to even more expensive papers, especially because I feel like a lot of you have either used this in the past or are currently using it. Next up, we have the Strathmore 400 series watercolor paper. Again, I feel this is a very common paper, and I see this being used by not necessarily more professional artists, but people that have more experience using watercolor tend to gravitate to something along the lines of this. The third paper we'll be testing out is this fluid 100% cotton watercolor paper. 100% cotton watercolor paper is what most professional watercolor artists tend to gravitate towards and recommend the most, and this particular paper I believe is on the slightly lower end of the price range scale in terms of 100% cotton papers, so definitely wanted to try that out as it puts it in a nice in-between category of starting to get into the fancier papers, but maybe not at such a steep price point. This particular one is also 300 pounds, which means it is almost double the paper weight of the other 2, which is notable because the last paper we will be testing out is the granddaddy of them all, and it is the Arches 300-pound watercolor paper. This stuff is what started this issue. I know it's not very exciting looking, but it comes in giant sheets that I have cut down, and so here is a size that will fit into the camera frame. This is why I possibly now have a problem with all other types of watercolor paper, so we are absolutely putting this to the test to see if it's actually worth the crazy price tag. I did just want to say first off though, that regardless of how this test goes, I have used all of these papers numerous times, and at least at the time, not noticed anything bad about them. They are all part of artworks that I'm quite happy with. So just keep that in mind if you feel like I'm tearing one of these papers to shreds in the tests. I'm really just trying to explain my observations of how I felt things went. Yeah, with all of that said, let's start trying out these watercolor papers. For the test, I did end up taping a sheet of each paper onto a masonite board, mostly because this is how I would personally use the paper all of the time, by taping it down to minimize as much warping as possible. But it also helped because it meant that I could switch between boards for filming easily. For the Arches paper, I used these smaller cut-off ends just from me cutting off larger sheets to paint with, because I was not about to sacrifice a full sheet of this stuff for a test. But before I taped the paper down, I laid each sheet out beside each other so that you could actually see the differences in the color of white of the paper, as well as the differences in texture of the paper. I know this photo seems pretty dark, but I really wanted to be able to show the texture or tooth of the paper as best I could on camera. I also did this weird Wolverine move to try and show you the differences in the actual thickness of the paper. The 300-pound papers are of course about twice as thick as the Canson and Strathmore papers, but surprisingly the fluid paper actually appears thicker than the arches. But now let's actually get into the test. For this I will be using the exact same brushes and materials, and in particular the paint color that I decided to use is Daniel Smith's Phthalo Blue Red shade. The first test that I decided to run was the most basic one, a squiggle of paint that is wet on dry and then a wet on wet squiggle. So wet the paper a little bit first and then do the same type of paint stroke on that area. Now I did try to keep these examples as close as humanly possible with the same level of water to paint mixture, as well as even trying to do them in relatively the same size. You will see that there are a few tests that I decided to do a second one of, just because for whatever reason I felt a bit weird about the first one. I also conducted all of the different types of paint swatch tests in the exact same order, so Canson to Strathmore to fluid to arches. A bit of a note on the fluid paper though, after this round of swatches I realized that I accidentally taped the paper on what would essentially be the wrong side. Technically you can use watercolor paper on both sides, but it did do a bit of a weird thing, and so I did end up flipping the paper, redoing the test, and then continuing all of the other tests on the right side. And lastly, I repeated the exact same test on the arches paper. Now, just as a general observation after this first round of tests, I wanted to mention just how much of a dry time difference there was between these papers, and also a warp factor. The Strathmore bubbled up easily the most and also took by far the longest to dry. By comparison, the fluid and arches dried very, very fast, like probably within a minute of doing the strokes, whereas the Strathmore and Canson took much longer. And here's a comparison of how the 4 different papers look. Now, you might prefer one of the looks of these to another, but let's get a little scientific and actually talk about what's going on here. The name of the game for this test is evenness. Now, it's fine if the stroke creates a bit of a gradient just as the pigment on the brush gradually reduces, but overall, the strokes in both the wet on wet and wet on dry tests should look fairly even. The Canson actually performed pretty well at this. On the wet on dry stroke, the pigment is a little intense at the beginning. It could have just been the pigment on my brush, as this was literally the first stroke that I made in this test, and maybe I didn't water down the paints as much. It also could just be that the paint is sitting on top of the paper a little more. The wet on wet is also pretty even. It maybe spiderwebs out a little strangely on some of the edges, like the feathering of the pigment does a little bit of weirdness maybe, but overall I would say that's a pretty decent wet on wet stroke. The Strathmore turned out interesting, and I do think some of this was human error, especially the wet on dry stroke. I think I blanked out and might have gone over the beginning of the stroke again without like fully thinking about what I was doing, which is why it has that bit of a weird double stroke there. So ignoring the edges that it sort of created, the pigment overall in that does look like it's sitting pretty evenly. The wet on wet though is something else, and I do know that I specifically called this paper out for bubbling so much, which it did, and to my best knowledge, I don't think that I added a considerable amount more water to this paper, especially because I repeated the test twice. I really just think that the water did not soak into the paper that well, which is why it creates this really uneven, weird looking wet on wet stroke. Like you can see just how unusually shaped the finished strokes are, despite it you know, in theory should be pretty even. The texture that this does create is pretty interesting though, so you might prefer something that looks like this. The problem that I would have though is that it means it's incredibly unpredictable. For the fluid swatches, now these are on what is the correct side of the paper. Overall, they are very even. You can see just how even they are. This paper did do, in some places, this weird kind of like flecking, like it was almost like chunks of the paper were flaking off. It could also just be more that there are very distinct areas in which the pigment just was not absorbing into the paper. I don't know, it's kind of weird, and I've never really experienced that before, and it's not something that any of the other papers seem to have been doing. But in terms of the overall look, you probably can tell just by these pictures how much the pigment did sink into the paper, especially on the first or like middle wet on wet section. It has that like speckled white-ish look, which is like the paper showing through almost, so it's like really embedded into the paper. But even then, despite how much that wet on wet stroke bloomed out, it does really retain its overall shape. As for the arches, the wet on dry stroke looks pretty much perfect. Like there is not a single weird splotchy area in that stroke. It is so even. The wet on wet stroke though, I'm not really sure what happened. It might have been that the water just soaked into the paper so fast that it didn't really spread out much, and where it did, it does appear to be even. Like the overall pigment gradation does look pretty smooth. It just didn't spread out that much. So here's a look at the four of them against each other again, now that you've heard my more scientific explanation as to what is going on there, and so you can compare the different areas now knowing what I was looking for in terms of the results for this test. The next test we're going to do is a blending test. Now I did two different types of blending tests. The first one I did with a flat brush, and I did 2 strokes with 1 dip of paint, dipped my brush into the water, rinsed it off a bit, lightly dipped it into my paint again, and then did 2 more strokes. So the idea for that is it would create a bit of a gradient. I did make sure that the strokes were slightly overlapping. I did mess this one up a little, but overall it's still going to be a readable test, which you will see. The second blending test is much more straightforward and simple, just dipping your brush into the paint, doing a bit of a patch, and then dipping your brush back into water and continuing to pull down that pigment into what is hopefully going to be an even gradient. Now what this test will tell us in terms of the paper aspect of this is exactly how quickly the paint or pigment is settling into the paper. Ideally, between the horizontal flat strokes, there wouldn't be any noticeable overlapping lines where I overlapped the paint. It should be pretty nice and even. Also in terms of how the pigment settles on both of the blending tests, the gradation and pigment should hopefully be settling fairly evenly again, so that it's a nice, smooth gradient and blend. And here's how the 4 turned out. I'm not gonna lie, by far, I think this was the most shocking test. I feel like I probably don't really need to explain just how many light years are between the top 2 and the bottom 2 in terms of evenness. Now for the stripes on the Canson one, I will fully admit to user error on that front in terms of it not being an even gradient, but like I did mention before, it's not going to have affected just how badly the stripes between the individual strokes are. So yes, it didn't create anything even close to an even gradient from a dark to light, top to bottom, but I could have applied the paint in the most perfect manner and it would not have helped those crazy lines between the strokes. In terms of the areas where the paper is like completely showing through within the stroke, I'm not exactly too worried about that. I mean, it could be an indication of how much the paper is absorbing the moisture on the brush and showing that paper texture, but that's not really what I was looking for in this test, so kind of ignore that, I guess, for each of these examples. In terms of the other blending test, you can see how insanely uneven that is in terms of like gradient, and of all of the tests that I did, the one that I am like sticking behind doing in the exact same manner for all of these papers, it is that blending test. That thing should have been bulletproof across all of them. Again, similar results for the Strathmore paper. I will say though, the horizontal blending exercise with the flat brush does, while uneven, look quite interesting and cool, but again, it's that unpredictability of it might not always turn out that interesting looking in terms of the texture. Some of these things though are definitely things that you could work around if you were using the paper. You know, every watercolor paper is different and you're going to use them all different, and so doing these very static tests across them in the exact same manner is just something to keep in mind, because you would not necessarily use every single watercolor paper in the exact same way, like I'm essentially doing in this test. The second blending swatch is inexcusable though. The fluid paper. Now, this is what I was expecting pretty much all of the secondary blending tests to look like. That nice, even gradient. It's such a simple technique. They should all look like that. But you can also really tell just how much the pigment has soaked into this paper. For lack of a better term, it just kind of looks dry. You can see that white paper texture starting to show through. This was one layer, so that is something that you wouldn't necessarily notice when you were building up colors in a painting or something. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's like a detrimental part of this paper. And the horizontal bands clearly look much more consistent and even than we have seen so far in this test. And finally, the arches paper. You can see both of these again look much more even than we have seen. I would say both of them are affected by the same aspect of this paper, and that is the paint settles and dries very fast. So that is why there is slightly more banding on the horizontal swatches, and also probably why there isn't as smooth of a gradient on the secondary blending test. But despite how fast it dries, you can see how much the pigment is still nice and rich. It doesn't have as much of that white speckling dry look as the fluid paper has. So in terms of this test, I would say that the fluid paper appears to be the most smooth, although the excessive almost sinking of the pigment into the paper makes me lean towards more of the arches being my preferred outcome. Next, we're going to be doing a paint drop test. So I wet a section of my paper and then using an eyedropper, squeezed a drop of paint into that wet section. Now ideally what's going to happen here, because you're using a drop of paint, that drop should spread out pretty evenly within the wet area. I did film and keep in the paint actually spreading to the point where I felt like it probably wasn't going to change anymore, but I did speed it up a lot, so that is not how fast the paint actually spread on the paper in real time. Because you're dropping and using gravity to place the drop of paint within the wet area, not only should the shape be even, but also the pigment distribution. And here are the results of the finished and dried drop tests. I feel like these results are pretty self-explanatory, but the Canson one, while I will give it a little latitude because it did take me a minute to actually get some of the paint into the eyedropper, which is why it possibly didn't spread out as much as the other ones, it still doesn't really excuse the overall lopsided shape of the drop. The pigment is actually nice and evenly spread though. Like there's no extremely noticeable light or dark area within the drop. The Strathmore one also looks pretty good, especially seeing it in comparison to the other ones. I much prefer the results of the Strathmore drop to the fluid drop. They're both the same sort of lopsided shape, which I'm actually quite surprised in the fluid one because it hadn't been doing anything weird really up until now. But the pigment on the Strathmore is overall fairly even. You can see there's a slight ring around the outside that is slightly darker, as well as that slight darker middle drop, which tends to be what happens in these tests because that's where the pigment initially lands, and so that's just kind of where it settles more and why it's darker. But the fluid example just really does not look very attractive. It's lopsided. The discoloration, because of how much it was sinking into the paper, doesn't really look nice. I actually, even despite its extreme unevenness, prefer the look of the Canson drop to the fluid. And then we have the Arches drop, which you pretty much could not get a more perfect shape or evenness of pigmentation. Yes, it has that slightly darker drop in the center, but you can just see how perfectly circular that drop spread out to be. And outside of that middle center dark section, the rest of the pigment is incredibly even. Next, we'll be running a bit of a scrub and lift test. I painted a pretty solid rectangular swatch on all of the papers, let that completely dry, and then using a watercolor scrub brush, did 5 back and forth strokes across that swatch to see how much it would lift. I also took another synthetic watercolor brush that I use a lot for blending and lifting paint and stuff like this to see if I could blend the edge out. That's probably the technique that I use more often in my work, not necessarily completely lifting out color, but more just blending harsh edges, and so wanted to do that little test for myself. This test is essentially determining how much the paint is actually sinking into the paper. Ideally, it wouldn't be incredibly easy to remove. That is a nice feature sometimes, but it could mean that building up color isn't as easy because the underneath paint can constantly be reactivated and moved. And here are the 4 dried results. I will say, just as a whole, I was actually pretty surprised how easy it was to lift this color out of the paper. It's a pretty staining, intense blue color, and so I was definitely expecting it to move around a lot less. The arches probably reacted the closest to what I was expecting to happen to all of them, where you can see when I did the secondary blend test, there's still quite a harsh edge there that I couldn't really blend out, especially compared to the Canson one where you would never really know there was ever a harsh edge there, and it has this nice smooth gradient for once. So what that tells us is the paint is sitting far more on top of the paper in the Canson example than something like the arches. Even regardless of the scrubbing and blending, the swatch itself is very telling with how the paint is actually sitting and reacting to each of the papers. The Canson is noticeably darker because it's sitting closer to the top. The Strathmore is still doing that weird texture thing that I honestly don't know what is up with it. It does, again, sometimes look cool, but it also can look very messy and almost amateur, because normally something like that would only happen with somebody that doesn't actually know how to apply watercolor evenly. And the fluid and arches look about even in terms of paint absorption, although I'm surprised that the fluid actually blended out as smoothly and evenly as it did, considering just how much I've been talking about the paint sinking so far into the page. And the final test is a bit of a bonus test, but I wanted to try a very granulating watercolor paint on this paper. In particular, I decided to use Daniel Smith's Moonglow. It is one of the most infamous granulating paint colors. It separates like crazy, and so you will really be able to see the texture of the color and paper and just how everything reacts to each other. And for this test, I just did another round of wet on wet and wet on dry strokes. And here are the results. As you can see, a pretty wild paint color. It separates into this green and pinky purple outside of the gray tone, and it's pretty unpredictable, which is why it almost did a completely different thing on each of these papers. I will say, despite me seemingly tearing the Canson paper to shreds, it did actually react very interestingly to this paint. I'm sure it has something to do with the paint seemingly not really sinking into this paper as much as other ones when looking at the other tests we've done so far, but that upper wet on dry swatch looks really, really cool. The Strathmore in comparison is almost disappointing. You're using this paint to really see that color split that it ends up doing, and this result is just kind of blah and gray, especially when you look at what this paint did on the fluid paper and just how much it separated, especially in the wet on wet. Even the wet on dry has that really nice granulated look and that color split, and even though overall this does look kind of crazy, this is essentially what this paint ends up doing. On the arches paper, it did react a little more evenly, but you can see in the wet on wet, it does still have that granulated color splitting look. It's just overall, I guess, a more uniform look. I did end up doing 2 wet on dry swatches because I felt that the top swatch I might have used a little bit of a drier brush than in other ones, so I redid that, and so the side swatch is another wet on dry. And so that right one might be a bit better of an example as to how this paper reacts. And again, here's the 4 of them together so that you can compare them. Very different results between all of them, and really the only one I'm disappointed in is the Strathmore paper. The other ones, while sometimes a little unpredictable because of the paint, still give off a much more appealing result, I feel. And that's going to be it for the tests on these papers today. Here's a look at all of the tests in comparison to each other. I really tried to be as analytical and just observe really what the paint was doing on the paper as much as I possibly could. I don't really like trashing on art supplies. It's really even shocking to me how different the paper can react to the exact same materials. And I don't want you to feel like if I said something negative about one of these papers that automatically counts it out as like a valid art material to use. I think if anything, it's just more important to understand the strengths and weaknesses of your individual paper. For instance, if I came out of this test saying that the Arches paper was my favorite, you might not really like how even the look of the paint is on that paper. You might prefer something like the Strathmore where it has more of that texture. So I really don't want to crown a winner here. I will very realistically probably end up using all of these papers again in the future. I would just have the takeaway of this video be to understand why your paint reacts a certain way on your paper and maybe inspire you to run your own tests on a variety of the watercolor paper that you have. And that's going to be everything for this video. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one.